The invitation arrived without punctuation. Process alignment, 9:07 a.m. No agenda, no dial-in notes, just a blue link blinking on my screen while the office hummed its usual fluorescent indifference. I noticed the time first, 7 minutes past the hour. Sloppy. Legal never schedules sloppily. I joined muted, as instructed. 3 faces were already there. The CFO, too calm. The head of people, smiling the way people do when they're about to say your name like it's a conclusion. And a man I didn't recognize, camera angled too low, badge clipped high. External counsel, maybe? Or someone pretending to be. "Thank you for joining," the CFO said. No greeting, no small talk. That was when I knew. My access indicator flickered. Email, offline. Internal drive, disconnected. They hadn't waited. Someone had pulled the cord while my camera was still warming up. "This is about alignment," the HR head said. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "We've decided to move forward without your role." Without. Not from. Not with changes. Without, like I was a feature toggle. I asked one question evenly. "Is compliance present?" A pause. Too long. The man with the low camera cleared his throat. "We're handling this internally." That was a violation. Minor on its own, fatal in sequence. They read from a script: gratitude, restructuring, momentum. I watched their mouths move while my mind ran faster, cataloging errors. Termination without compliance sign-off, no documented cause, no secure handoff of audit custody. They had deactivated me before closing the meeting, before logging the decision. They thought speed was power. "Your severance will be emailed," HR said, glancing at a screen she no longer controlled. I nodded once, said nothing. Silence has a way of making people rush to fill it. The call ended. My reflection stared back at me in the black glass. 32. Calm pulse. Steady hands. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to learn, was that I didn't just work in audits. I'd built the one they were still standing inside. And it was still running. By noon, the building had already forgotten me. My badge deactivated mid-morning meant the elevator wouldn't recognize my weight anymore. Corporate gravity is selective like that. I drove home instead, not in anger, but in inventory. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Personal machine, clean network, no company residue. That mattered. What I was about to do required separation as precise as surgery. The first thing I checked was an email. It was the audit scheduler. Still live. They hadn't reassigned ownership, hadn't frozen workflows. A rookie mistake disguised as confidence. The quarterly internal audit, designed, scoped, and approved 18 months earlier, was still running under my architecture. Immutable triggers, automated escalation, no single point of interruption. I smiled once, then stopped. Emotion clouds judgment. Documentation does not. I pulled the termination timeline from memory and mapped it against policy. Termination executed without compliance witness. Access revoked prior to exit log. Custody of audit materials unassigned. Each item alone was noise. Together, they formed pattern. I began recording. Not notes, evidence. Screenshots of access denial timestamps. Server logs showing role revocation preceding HR authorization. A quiet discrepancy in the vendor risk dashboard. One override approved by an executive account that should have required dual review. That one made me pause. I cross-referenced it with an old memo I'd written months earlier. Deferred remediation, material if repeated. They'd acknowledged it, then buried it. Now it was live again, Rerouted through a different vendor, same signature pattern. Not negligence. Continuity. My phone buzzed. A former colleague, careful with words. Did they really cut you loose? I typed back nothing. Silence preserves leverage. By evening, I had a timeline clean enough to testify without raising my voice. They thought firing me removed friction. They didn't realize they'd removed the only person who kept their shortcuts from colliding. I closed the laptop. Let the audit continue. Pressure doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. They moved fast after that. Fast and loud, the way people do when they think momentum can substitute for accuracy. By morning, an all-hands email circulated with my absence edited into something palatable. Organizational streamlining. Evolving risk philosophy. My name appeared once, bracketed by gratitude and past tense. The implication was clear. I had been a process problem, not a safeguard. Someone forwarded it to me from a personal account. No commentary, just the document, like a mirror held up without judgment. What struck me wasn't the dismissal. It was the confidence. They claimed governance improvements already underway, claimed new controls, claimed alignment with regulatory best practices. Each sentence was written to reassure investors, not regulators. Different audiences, different liabilities. I read it slowly, once for tone, once for content. On the third pass, I started marking inconsistencies. They referenced a compliance framework they hadn't adopted, promised oversight from a committee that didn't exist, asserted segregation of duties that their own system architecture contradicted. It was aspirational compliance, dangerous in writing. At noon, a board member spoke at a conference. I watched the clip later, volume low. He laughed lightly when asked about internal controls. "We've moved past rigid, old-model oversight," he said. "We trust our leadership." Trust is not a control. It's a vulnerability. My phone buzzed again. Different number this time. A journalist, maybe. Or legal. I let it ring out. I wasn't interested in commentary. Commentary creates noise. Noise dilutes signal. Instead, I opened the audit dashboard again. New activity flagged itself in amber. Someone was trying to reroute a review path. Subtle, almost elegant. Almost. They were correcting for me. That was the moment it sharpened. Not anger, not satisfaction. Certainty. They weren't just minimizing my role. They were rewriting the system while standing inside it, assuming the walls would hold. I closed the email, archived the clip, logged the attempted reroute, and waited. Because when people start correcting narratives instead of processes, the story always catches up to them. The breaking point wasn't emotional, it was technical. It came disguised as a routine variance alert, one I had written myself, tuned to ignore noise and surface only repetition. The same override, third occurrence, same approval chain, same vendor shell, newly renamed. The system flagged it not as an error, but as intent. I leaned back and let the room go quiet. Materiality isn't about size. It's about pattern plus knowledge. They had both now, and so did I. I pulled the old memo from my archive, the one they'd acknowledged with polite language and no follow-through. Deferred remediation accepted under business necessity. That phrase had bothered me then. It bothered me more now. Business necessity is not a defense when repetition becomes design. I checked the timestamps. The latest override had been approved after my termination. 12 minutes after, to be exact. Someone had stepped in quickly, like they were afraid the door would lock behind them. I documented without commentary. No adjectives, no conclusions, just sequence. Then I stopped. This was the line. the one you don't cross casually. Internal escalation would trigger containment, not correction. External escalation would change the nature of everything: careers, companies, reputations, including mine. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted resolution. I drafted nothing, sent nothing. Instead, I updated my timeline and attached the evidence to a secure folder labeled with the date alone. Clean, unemotional, ready. Outside, the afternoon light shifted across the floor, slow and indifferent. I made tea, let it steep longer than usual. They still thought this was about me, about a role eliminated, a philosophy replaced. They were wrong. This was about a system continuing to do exactly what it was designed to do when people assumed it wouldn't. I closed the folder and set a reminder, not to act, but to observe. Because once intent is established, time stops being your enemy. It becomes your witness. The audit didn't escalate loudly. It never does. There was no alert storm, no red banner, no frantic calls. Just a quiet shift in routing logic. Automatic, compliant, irreversible. At 6:14 a.m., the system executed its scheduled transition from internal review to external notice. Not a complaint, not an accusation. A clarification request, framed in the language regulators trust because they wrote it. I watched it happen from my kitchen, coffee cooling, untouched. The request went to an agency contact I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Someone methodical. Someone who read footnotes before headlines. Subject line: request for context. Audit continuity flag, neutral. Almost polite. Within minutes, the dashboard updated. Status changed from monitoring to engaged. That word always felt heavier than it looked. Engagement meant humans. Humans meant questions. Questions meant timelines instead of narratives. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I checked my documentation again, looking for gaps. There were none. Every decision point traced back to policy. Every log aligned with statute. I'd built it that way on purpose, long before I ever imagined needing it. By mid-morning, they felt it. An internal memo went out retracting yesterday's confidence. Language softened. Certainty dissolved into review. Someone tried, again, to reroute the audit path. The attempt failed. Authority hierarchy locked them out. They had given me architecture and never bothered to understand it. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, an email arrived. No branding, no pleasantries, just a request for a conversation to provide context. Context is what people ask for when facts no longer bend. I replied with a single sentence. I'm available when appropriate parties are present. Then I closed the laptop. The trap didn't snap shut. It didn't need to. It was already closed the moment they assumed firing me meant disabling the system that remembered them better than they remembered themselves. By the third day, silence became procedural. Subpoenas don't arrive with sirens. They arrive as calendar holds and polite requests for preservation. Legal teams recognize the shift immediately. Everyone else mistakes it for a delay. The company issued an internal notice about cooperation with routine inquiries. Routine is a word people use when they hope repetition will make it true. Access logs were pulled, then pulled again, this time by someone who noticed the gap, those 12 minutes after my termination when approvals moved faster than policy allowed. The pattern stopped being abstract. It acquired names. I received the call in the afternoon. Not an apology, not a demand. A question, asked carefully by someone who knew how answers travel. Were you responsible for the audit framework currently under review? Yes, I said. One word is enough when it's accurate. They asked for documents. I sent an index, not the files. Dates, hashes, locations. Chain of custody intact. I offered availability with counsel present. They agreed without negotiating. Inside the company, people began to disappear from meetings. Calendars thinned. Language shifted from optimism to caution. Someone attempted a document purge and triggered a retention lock they didn't know existed. The system recorded the attempt. Quietly. Permanently. By evening, immunity was mentioned, not to me, but around me. I hadn't asked. You don't ask when you're aligned with statute. You wait for it to become necessary. I took a walk as dusk settled, the air cooler than it had been all week. I thought about restraint, not as virtue, but as method. I hadn't forced anything. I hadn't accused. I'd let the machinery do what it was designed to do when pressure exposed intent. Back home, I reviewed the timeline once more and closed it. No edits, no addenda. Unraveling isn't collapse. It's structure returning to its original shape, without the lies holding it together. The consequences arrived without ceremony. One morning, a resignation email circulated. Brief, carefully worded, effective immediately. By noon, a second followed. Titles disappeared from the org chart like punctuation removed from a sentence that could no longer pretend to make sense. The board issued a statement about accountability and cooperation. It said nothing, precisely. I was invited to a meeting held off-calendar. No company logo, no recording indicator. Just counsel, a regulator, and silence arranged with intent. They didn't ask me to speculate. They didn't need emotion. They needed confirmation. I gave them facts, dates, processes, decision points. I explained how the framework worked, not why it mattered. When they asked about intent, I referred them back to repetition. When they asked about impact, I referenced statute. When they asked about motive, I said nothing. Motive is for courtrooms and headlines. I was there for alignment. Someone mentioned my termination, softly, as if testing whether it would change the temperature of the room. It didn't. It had already been logged as context, not grievance. Outside, the company attempted dignity. An executive framed as stepping aside, another placed on indefinite leave. Legal language did what it always does: absorbed shock, redistributed blame. It was enough. At the end of the call, they thanked me for my professionalism. I nodded once. Professionalism is not generosity, it's discipline. I closed my notes and stood. No one asked me to stay. That was the reckoning, not the fallout, not the headlines that would follow quietly weeks later, but the moment the system acknowledged what I already knew. Justice doesn't require performance. It requires completion. Months later, the building looked smaller. New signage gleamed where the old name had been scrubbed away, glass polished to suggest renewal. I passed it on foot one afternoon, unplanned, the way you pass a former address without slowing. People moved inside with purpose, unaware of the architecture beneath their confidence. I wasn't mentioned in the coverage, not quoted, not referenced. The articles focused on reforms, leadership changes, forward motion. That was intentional. Truth works better without an audience. My career didn't pivot dramatically. It clarified. I declined offers that framed me as a fixer, accepted one that treated me as infrastructure. The work was quieter, the questions better. No one mistook restraint for weakness there. One evening, I opened the archive for the last time. Most of it I deleted: logs, correspondence, evidence whose purpose had already been served. Systems should not hoard, they should resolve. I kept one file, the original audit framework, untouched, clean. A reminder of why I build things to function without permission. Outside, night settled gently. I closed the laptop and let the silence remain unfilled. They had believed authority lived in titles, speed, confidence. They believed removing me would simplify risk. They believed the audit was a formality, not a memory. They were wrong, but not because I opposed them. Because systems don't take sides. They only record. And when the record is complete, it doesn't argue. It closes the file.